It's my pleasure to welcome you to Bloomsbury House for this discussion on the Ukraine crisis and the search for a new normal. And it's also a pleasure for me to introduce my colleague, Sam Charap, who's the Senior Fellow for Russia and Eurasia at the IISS, based in our Washington, D.C. office. Sam found himself in Moscow, I think it was, as this crisis was beginning to break over Ukraine and the Crimea. He, given his location in Washington, is obviously very familiar with debates in policy circles there, and he's just managed to come to the UK from Riga, which is a country, Latvia, a country presumably very interested in this developing story. I think the purpose of the meeting today is really for Sam to explain to us whether it's possible, after the flash and the drama, as it were, of the last several weeks, for relations between the West and Russia to settle into some new, fairly sustainable pattern of stability, and if not, why not, and with what consequences. So, Sam, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you. First, I would like to apologize for my somewhat casual appearance today. My suitcase didn't make it from Riga with my person, so I'm without suit and tie. Thank you all for coming this morning. One thing that was striking about the way that European and American senior officials addressed this crisis in their public remarks, with the exception of the first week, was the way they almost seemed to be sharing talking points. It was really quite remarkable how on message, in that sense, the West has been. And I'll give you some examples right now from what now seems like a different historical epoch, but really was late last month. And that was before pro-Russia groups in Ukraine, south and east, had seized several administrative buildings, but after the so-called referendum in Crimea was conducted and the legal formalities of the quote-unquote annexation completed, the first sanctions were implemented in response to that move, and the West focused on drawing a line at Russia's annexation of Crimea. So on March 20th, when he announced the sanctions, President Obama said, quote, "We're taking these steps as part of our response to what Russia has done already in Crimea. At the same time, the world is watching with grave concern as Russia has positioned its military in a way that could lead to further incursions into southern and eastern Ukraine. For this reason, we've been working closely with our European partners to develop more severe actions that could be taken if Russia continues to escalate the situation." Later that day, a senior U.S. administration official speaking on background told reporters, quote, "As we watch the Russian threat to Ukraine, to include the threats to southern and eastern Ukraine, we believe it is very important to signal that if Russia further escalates the situation, they will be met with severe consequences. The Hague Declaration, signed by the leaders of the G7 and the head of the EU Commission and the European Council, on March 24th stated, quote, "We remain ready to intensify actions, including coordinated sectoral sanctions that will have an increasingly significant impact on the Russian economy if Russia continues to escalate this situation." Another senior U.S. official, also speaking on background on March 25th, said, "The biggest hammer that can drop are sectoral sanctions, and the clearest trigger for those is intervention in eastern and southern Ukraine." British Prime Minister David Cameron, on the same day, quote, "There's a view that the status quo, i.e. Russian occupation and annexation of Crimea, is unacceptable, but then there's another very, very strong view that any further steps into eastern Ukraine would be even more serious and would result in much greater sanctions." So many hopeful transatlanticists sought to construe this remarkable consistency as a demonstration of a new seriousness of purpose in the West. But I would argue that the sort of repetition of a similar litany of prescriptions for resolution spoke more to the desperation of those uttering them to quickly find the kind of new stability that Adam was talking about for both Ukraine, Russia, and the international system than anything else. And the vision at the time for de-escalation took the following form, to quote a White House statement. The governments of Ukraine and Russia would hold direct talks facilitated by the international community. International monitors could ensure that the rights of all Ukrainians are protected, including ethnic Russians. Russian forces would return to their bases, and the international community would work together to support the Ukrainian people as they prepare for elections in May. In other words, Russia would keep Crimea, even if most of the world never accepted that. And the West would support the new Ukrainian government to become prosperous and democratic. Eventually, Russia would recognize the new Ukrainian government and ratchet down the economic and military pressure. In theory, this proposed outcome, let's call it just Crimea, seemed quite reasonable. However, all the talking points and buzzwords, and despite their consistent repetition, and no matter how many times they were repeated, did not in fact describe a sustainable equilibrium or a real endpoint to the crisis. Rather than leading to a quick and neat new normal, like the just Crimea model proposed, the disequilibrium and instability triggered by the Ukraine crisis seems likely to endure for some time. Rather than quick and neat, the search for the new normal promises to be long, costly, and highly disruptive, both of the individuals' lives affected on the ground and the international order. Now, the major flaw in the just Crimea model, so to speak, was that winning Crimea and losing the rest of Ukraine was not an acceptable outcome for Russia. Put differently, Russia did not invade Crimea in order only to annex Crimea. It did so in a somewhat desperate attempt to secure Russian interests in Ukraine, which extend far beyond the Crimean Peninsula. Indeed, the timeline of statements coming from Moscow and decisions suggest that the annexation, or what in Russia is now called the reunification of Crimea, did not necessarily reflect a coherent strategy. In the final days of February, when Russian President Vladimir Putin took the decision to insert special forces, paratroopers, and other servicemen into Crimea, he was seeking to prevent a strategic setback in Kiev from becoming a strategic catastrophe, Russia's nightmare scenario being completely pushed out of Ukraine by the West. That decision meant to secure the most important Russian physical assets on the ground, on the peninsula, and to coerce the new Ukrainian authorities into accommodating Moscow's broader interests in Ukraine, had almost immediate knock-on effects. It released latent separatist sentiment among the majority of the Crimean population and hardened the position of the new government in Kiev. In other words, despite Putin's statements reaffirming Ukraine's territorial integrity as late as March 4th, the invasion foreclosed other options other than annexation. And the swiftness with which the plan was executed, though, seemed to contribute to this impression that Russia had achieved its objectives after annexing Crimea. And many, of course, leaders in the West, and not only, wanted to believe that the story would end there. The problem is that we don't really have much evidence, and we didn't either at the time, that would support such a conclusion, in part because the annexation of Crimea did not achieve Russia's objectives. And that became clear on March 15th, the day, or I suppose the 17th, but clear at least to U.S. officials on March 15th, when a day before the so-called referendum, Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov handed U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry a draft text of a quote-unquote Friends of Ukraine International Action Plan. The Russian MFA published the proposal online a couple of days later, and the document contains 5 actionable points. Firstly, it calls for the fulfillment of the pledges contained in the agreement reached by the Ukrainian opposition and then President Viktor Yanukovych on 21st February to disband armed groups and deoccupy buildings in Ukraine. As we know, that settlement, which had been brokered by the European Union and Russia, lasted a mere hours before falling apart. Secondly, it outlines a new federal constitutional order for Ukraine, providing for, inter alia, neutrality, the direct election of regional governments, which would be granted a wide range of powers currently held by Kiev, and the elevation of Russian as an official state language, along with Ukrainian. Thirdly, after this constitution is approved by popular referendum, the Russian plan proposes that there be new elections at both the regional and national levels. And fourth, the document stipulates the right to self-determination of the people of Crimea, as expressed in the 16 March referendum. And finally, that the EU, US, and Russia should be guarantors of all of the above and codify it all in a UN Security Council resolution. One can find many of these provisions objectionable, but the contents of the document reveal something important, that it was naive at best to believe that Putin could be sated by Crimea alone. As clearly articulated in this Friends of Ukraine plan, Russia has interests in that country that go far beyond the territory that it has claimed. The Russian document should also have given Western leaders pause about the feasibility of their declared mission to transform Ukraine. After the change of government on February 22nd, or the night of February 21st, I suppose, the agreed EU-US policy for Ukraine was to double down on support, political, diplomatic, and financial, including via a new IMF loan package for the interim government, and to push through rapid structural reforms to modernize Ukraine's perpetually underperforming economy. Integration with the EU and cooperation with NATO would be accelerated, while democracy and support for civil society would receive a significant boost. The strategic end goal was to create a Western-oriented and integrated, prosperous, secure, and democratic Ukraine. That Russia's acquiescence to, if not outright support for, this plan would be necessary for its success was apparently too politically uncomfortable a fact to acknowledge. But noble intentions cannot overcome the economic fact that Ukraine's economy is highly dependent on Russia in a variety of ways that the West cannot afford to undo. In the short term, the most acute dependence is on energy. Ukraine's economy simply will not survive this crisis, despite the IMF package, and no matter how radical the reforms implemented by the new government, if it is required to pay the full price outlined in its 2009 contract with Russia. That price is somewhat higher than the European average, which was a function of the high oil price at the time of its signing. But it, of course, is much lower than that paid by most Asian countries for liquefied natural gas. Of course, Ukraine's economy is nowhere near as competitive as those. Moreover, Ukraine's dependency on Russia is not limited to gas. Up to a third of its exports go to Russia, and many of its value-added exports, particularly military-industrial ones, have no other market. Millions of Ukrainians also work in Russia and send remittances home, and so on. In short, the ugly truth, and perhaps that was not politically possible to acknowledge at the time, was that Russia, having annexed part of Ukraine, can still undermine any Western plan for Ukraine's future if it so chooses. And the current Western plan is to create what the Russian leadership would consider a strategic defeat for Russia in Ukraine. From the Russian perspective, in the aftermath of the Crimean annexation, the US and the EU have declared an intention to recreate the same conditions that led to that initial invasion. It should have come as no surprise, then, that Russia moved quickly after the annexation to ratchet up pressure on the Ukrainian government. As we've seen, what was originally a snap exercise on the border became a sustained buildup of a strike force estimated to be between 20,000 and 40,000 strong. Allegedly, special forces and operatives crossed the border to capitalize on southern and eastern Ukraine's discontent with the new government, and the Kremlin demanded prepayment, as provided for by the 2009 contract, for the following month's gas delivery. Immediately, fears of the Crimea scenario for the southern and eastern regions of Ukraine spread through Kiev and western capitals. A decision from Moscow to launch another land invasion, in my opinion, however, was and remains unlikely. Russia has demonstrated in recent weeks that it can effectively intervene in the bordering regions without a fully fledged invasion. And recent polling data suggests that only 11% of that part of Ukraine's residents would support such a move compared to the near universal welcome Russia received in Crimea. But territory in itself is not what motivates Russia, and sabotage and incitement in the south and east are far less costly ways of furthering the same objective that motivated the annexation of Crimea, namely securing Russian interests, as the Russian leadership sees it, in Ukraine. While Moscow may not want another land invasion, the forces set in motion by its moves have produced such a high level of tension on the ground that an outcome is possible even if decision makers might want to avoid it. In the wake of the Crimea referendum, Ukraine's acting president, Turchinov, began arming a new National Guard to defend the country against what the Minister of Interior called extremists from within and from without. A rapid increase in the number of armed, poorly disciplined young men, disproportionately from Ukraine's center and west in the context of a violent insurgency in the south and east, significantly increases the risk of civil conflict. And such an intra-Ukrainian civil conflict could easily precipitate a Russian invasion. Indeed, there are also a number of other contingencies that could produce the same outcome. For example, Crimea receives 80% of its water from mainland Ukraine, along with along with much of its electricity, heating fuel, and telecommunication links. And Russia has no direct land-based access to Crimea. There have been at least 2 partial blackouts in Simferopol already, and Russian media alleges that the canal supplying water to the peninsula from the mainland has indeed been cut off, although so far only agricultural concerns and not consumers have lost water. But if the crisis escalates to a point where Ukraine decides to fully cut off Crimea, which cannot be ruled out, even if Russia does not move further into Ukraine first, the Russian military may respond by seizing more territory. Indeed, even before the referendum, Russian special forces seized a natural gas compression station in the Kherson region, just north of Crimea. In addition, Russia uses a corridor through southeastern Ukraine for access to its forces stationed in Moldova's breakaway Transnistria province. And the Russian citizens living there depend on transit through Ukraine to get to Russia. Ukraine has largely closed its border with Russia and tightened border controls on the Moldovan border. And as we've heard from President Putin, this has been alleged to be a blockade on Transnistria. At the very least, even if that has been debunked to a certain extent, Russia will have difficulty supplying its soldiers in Transnistria eventually. And at that point, the military on the ground may well act. But barring those contingencies, or any number of other ones created by the circumstances that we now find ourselves in, Moscow has little incentive to launch an overt invasion. The instability in the south and east is already producing results. The Ukrainian government has declared its intention to reform the constitution, decentralizing decision-making, allowing for elected regional governors, and providing for regional language rights. While Russia's brazen aggression has achieved this much, it has also made following through on these declarations an even more politically fraught task. After all, the current government has several other constituencies to worry about besides the south and east, including its electoral base in the center and west, the civically engaged Ukrainians who led the Euromaidan movement, and of course the armed nationalist groups that transformed that peaceful protest into an armed uprising, especially right sector. And none of these constituencies want the government to make major concessions on governance to a country currently occupying sovereign Ukrainian territory, especially not concessions that would empower their political foes. Ukraine's presidential election, scheduled for May 25th, further raises the stakes. The problem with that election, if it does take place, and I think that's increasingly a big if, is that only one person can win it. If previous Ukrainian presidential elections are any guide, the 2 candidates who face off in an eventual second-round vote are likely to reflect Ukraine's regional cleavages, and the campaign may well further accentuate those divides. While the government and its Western backers insist on the importance of the vote, a divisive election might well completely rend asunder Ukraine's delicate social fabric and spark the kind of civil conflict that so far we have yet to see. But in fact, that fabric might have already been irrevocably damaged by the way in which Yanukovych was overthrown. Specifically, that he was ousted under pressure from far-right armed groups, which remain armed and in control of at least one building in Kiev, and that his government, made up of largely Southerners and Easterners like him, was replaced by a new cabinet of which more than half the members are from the former Habsburg provinces in the west of the country. It's important to dwell for a moment on just how regionally skewed and thus unrepresentative of the country the current government is. Around 60% of its top officials, ministers and above, come from the former Habsburg provinces. A third are from Lviv itself. Only 2 members of the new government hail from the south and east. So 60% of the government are from regions that comprise 12% of the population. The previous government of Mykola Azarov featured 75% of the ministerial level leadership from the south and east of the country, with 42% from Donetsk itself, which of course was Yanukovych's hometown or home province. In other words, that government was equally regionally unbalanced, but the south and east represent nearly 50% of the country's total population. All this is not to say that Ukrainians in the south and east have any special affection for the former government and the now exiled former president, given the corruption and economic monopolization by his extended quote-unquote family over which he presided. But considering how lopsided the new government is in terms of its regional makeup, it comes as no surprise that half of the residents in these areas that is the 8 southern and eastern regions of Ukraine, believed that the events of late February were a, quote, armed coup that brought to power a government and an acting president they considered to be, quote unquote, illegal. In the Donetsk and Lugansk regions, those holding such views amount to over 70% of the population. That same survey where those numbers come from, which covered Donetsk, Lugansk, Kherson, Odessa, Zaporozhye, Kharkiv, Mykolaiv, Dnipropetrovsk, and was taken in mid-April, showed a number of other aspects of popular opinion in that part of the country that should have the new government deeply concerned. Over 50% of respondents agree with the statement that right sector, the armed nationalist groups still occupying, as I mentioned, at least one building in Kiev, is, quote, a major military formation with significant influence on the authorities, which represents a threat to citizens and the integrity of the country. Again, in Donetsk and Lugansk, the figure of those who agree with that statement is over 70%. Now, of course, that's not true, but nonetheless, the perceptions are important. And while only 11% support Russian troops being deployed to Ukraine in the south and east overall, that number is 19% in Donetsk and Lugansk. And the numbers on that score even get more disturbing from Kiev's perspective. When asked if a Russian threat to their home region would compel them to take up arms, only 5.7% of respondents in the south and east responded positively, and in Donetsk only 1.7%. One would assume that that number would be even lower if the question were asked about a Russian threat to another region besides the respondent's home. So while some have praised the new government's appointment of hometown oligarchs, so to speak, as governors in some of these regions, and at least in one case, which Ihor Kolomoisky in Dnipropetrovsk, seems to have been a relative success, overall that decision was not grounded in a nuanced understanding of popular views, popular opinion in the south and east. In the same poll, 65% of respondents support at least partial nationalization of oligarchs' assets, 65%. The very principles of the market economy in this part of Ukraine have been fundamentally undermined by the merger of power, wealth, and criminality. Disappointingly, but perhaps not surprisingly, only 4.3% of respondents agree with the statement, quote, the state should respect private property and create mechanisms for its protection. 4.3%. In terms of the big picture, though, it's clear that with the partial exception of Donetsk and Lugansk, there is no significant constituency for separatism, classically defined, in the south and east. This isn't Crimea. But at least half of the region's population does not want to live under this government. Essentially what we are seeing is a sharpening of the divisions that have plagued Ukraine since independence. It's not that this part of the country wants to be part of Russia. Instead, the problem is that many of these Ukrainians have a very different idea about what it means to be Ukrainian than their fellow citizens in the center and west. And second, that many on both sides of that divide reject the other side's idea of what it means to be Ukrainian and seek to impose their own views on that other side. Clearly, this is what the South and East feel is happening right now, but it wasn't too long ago that the shoe was on the other foot. The rise of the far-right party Svoboda, which captured majorities of 3 regional parliaments in the west of the country in the October 2010 elections, and is one of the coalition members of this current government, can only be understood in the context of the divisive policies of the Yanukovych government. His Minister of Education, in particular, had a knack for infuriating many in the west of the country with statements like, quote, Ukrainian isn't a real language. It's not going to earn you any friends in Lviv, I should say. The hope of some in the West that Russian aggression would change all that, i.e. unite Ukrainians on issues that had always divided them, has turned out to be another case of wishful thinking. If we take the issue of NATO membership, always a divisive issue in Ukraine, it remains, after the annexation, popular only in western Ukraine, with 64% in favor, but deeply unpopular in the south, with only 11% in favor, and the east, with 14%. As my colleague and co-author in the previous issue of Survival, Keith Darden, has written, even when they're surrounded by battle-ready Russian forces and at the risk of annexation themselves, Southerners and Easterners seem more interested in having the Russian military protect them from NATO than they are in having NATO protect them from Russia. So previous Ukrainian governments have had the luxury of governing without taking into account these divides. This one does not. And the seriousness, Kiev needs to start pursuing national unity with a seriousness of purpose that we have yet to see or are only beginning to see, and stop sending in the military to confront its own citizens under the guise of counterterrorism, if it is to have any country left to govern. One can argue also that seriousness of purpose is lacking in the current Western approach to the diplomatic track. Thus far, the West has been faithful to President Obama's pronouncement in his speech in Brussels that, quote, on the fundamental principle that is at stake here, the ability of nations and peoples to make their own choices, there can be no going back. This is, of course, a noble principle, but given Russia's influence, determination, and willingness to absorb costs for this cause, if the West is not prepared to intervene directly and coerce results, it should be prepared to compromise and negotiate a deal. But there has been little support for this view in Western capitals. In fact, following the Geneva Agreement's collapse, the view in Washington, at least, seems to be that the Russians don't want a deal, and that there is widespread anger and frustration at the highest levels of the U.S. government with the perceived duplicity of the Russian government on this score. And I think we should allow for the possibility that Russia has, in fact, decided that after the collapse of the February 21st agreement, that no deal with the West is worth the paper it's written on. Instead, Moscow seems to want something carved in stone, a real insurance policy that the nightmare scenario cannot materialize. Protracted instability and or de facto separation or partition might be the strategy chosen to achieve that outcome. So rather than a definitive new stability or a new outcome, therefore, I think this crisis is likely to lead to a period of sustained disequilibrium and instability, first and foremost for Ukraine, but also for Russia and the international system. Even in a best-case scenario, and I think we're already past this point, Russia will be under U.S. and EU sanction for decades. The measures implemented at the time of writing, or at the time, I suppose, as of last week, were explicitly linked to the annexation of Crimea, and it will be decades before that move is undone, if ever. After all, 80% of Russians support Crimea being part of Russia. It's hard for me to imagine what new government in the future would be able to rapidly undo that. And it's also important to note that the knock-on effects of these sanctions has been quite real already, even before the last round. Borrowing costs for a country that is very dependent on access to Western capital, increasing as much as they have, risk premiums increasing as much as they have, and investment decisions being reversed in the way that they have been in an economy starved for investment, are all real and palpable effects. Moreover, the sort of grand project of Russia's international integration into the global economy, at least from the West perspective, is over, with things like OECD membership being halted, and it's unimaginable that in any short-term perspective could be returned to. And while Russia has not yet deliberately made trouble for the West on other international issues, it seems that at some point it will inevitably begin to play the role of a spoiler on any of those issues that do matter to Washington and European capitals. After all, even though so far we have yet to see any declared response, and so far that spoiler behavior hasn't occurred, under much less severe circumstances in 2007, 2008, we saw quite similar things. And it's important to note that, as far as the international order exists, it depends on a basic level of comity among the permanent members of the UN Security Council. And for Russia, or with Russia, I should say, that level of comity is gone and might well never return. So I guess my concluding remark would be that the possibility of collective action to address global challenges might well be the most significant victim of this crisis in the long term.
Great. Thank you very much indeed, Sam. There's plenty for us to reflect on and people to come in on. We'll now open it up to questions and comments. If you'd like to ask a question or make a statement, get my attention and then introduce yourself for the benefit of the rest of the audience. Yes, please. Yeah.
Thank you. My name is Irina Nutrition. I'm a partner and head of the IISS team at Brian K. Walker. My question is, well, so first of all, thank you very much for the very, very useful summary. And my question is regarding propaganda, which you did not mention. Russian propaganda with respect to the situation in Ukraine and the role of that propaganda in winning public opinion in Russia and in certain extent influencing the general strategy handling this crisis. Notably, I would like you to address the rhetoric that Ukraine actually never been a separate country. It's a new Russia, which recently came in debates in Russia, and the fact is that basically there is no Ukrainian language, and so basically there are no Ukrainians. So therefore, it's only rightful that Russia now takes with rightfully its own and obviously reinstates the historic order. Thank you.
So I think that's sort of two questions. Should we take a couple, or?
Why don't we do that, yes.
Okay.
Adam Roberts, please.
Adam Roberts from Oxford University. I thought that was a wonderful presentation. Thank you very much indeed. Just two issues. The first is about overall Western policy before the crisis, in the years before the crisis. It's at least arguable that there had been a failure to understand how sensitive Ukraine was to Russia's, as it were, injured pride, and the attempt to make Ukraine a prosperous Western state was always going to run into difficulty on that front. And that's an issue on which there's a specific American and a specific European side. The European one came to surface recently when, belatedly, there was a report in Brussels stating that there had been a failure to distinguish between the various countries in which the EU had relations in the East. They were all treated the same. And it's that failure of specificity which is striking. And that leads to my second question, very briefly. If we need, among other things, and you implied that we do, a dramatic change in Western as well as Russian policy, is there any point in what are the limitations of a serious proposal for neutrality or neutralization of Ukraine?
Thank you. Why don't we take those?
On the first question, I think there are sort of two there. Propaganda or information warfare, whatever is going on, however you want to describe it, and the rhetoric of senior officials, which of course are related. On the first score, clearly, if you watch Russian TV, you can get a you don't have to wait long until you understand that there's a particular party line being put forward here. In terms of its impact on Russian popular opinion vis-a-vis Crimea, the number that I cited of, well, it's 79%, I believe, of Russians who support Crimea being part of Russia. I have to go back to the exact date, but that is at least a mid-March, if not an early March number. And therefore, in terms of its direct impact on Russian popular opinion, I don't know if I would necessarily subscribe to that. But the broader point to make about popular opinion and shaping of it is that the Russian leadership is both extremely sensitive to and does its best to shape the views of the majority of Russians, and that it is a dynamic feedback where I don't think you can necessarily point exclusively to messaging on Russian television to explain Russian popular opinion, and nor vice versa. In terms of the rhetoric, in a way, this is where sort of nothing new. We can recall the statement by the famous one by Putin to then President George Bush at the Bucharest summit about Ukraine not being a real country. This reviving in terms of rhetoric, the way I see the uses of these terms like Novorossiya and so on, and the consistent emphasis on protecting Russians as being the motive, or returning Crimea, undoing this historical wrong, as more about justifying and explaining this decision and what's going on in the rest of Ukraine to a domestic audience that actually doesn't want to go to war with Ukraine. The irony is that also in that same poll that showed 79% of Russians support Crimea being part of Russia, 74% of Russians do not support war with Ukraine. So a lot of this, I think, has to be draped in other kinds of rhetorical tropes in order to be, in order not to be cause problems at home. First of all, thank you very much, Professor Roberts, for coming. On the question of Western policy, I think in terms of the Eastern Partnership, and more broadly the fact that the association agreement with Ukraine was basically the same enlargement model without the membership perspective and the structural funding was a mistake. And it wasn't just a mistake because Russia objected to it. It was a mistake on objective grounds because Ukraine is not the same as Poland or the Czech Republic or the Baltic states, and the circumstances are extremely different, and therefore the engagement, of course, should be there, but it should be adjusted to the circumstances on the ground. But in a combination of sort of bureaucratic tendencies to push the sort of copy button on the Xerox machine as opposed to rethinking concepts, especially in the context where you need 28 countries buy-in to change anything. Once those decisions are taken, they become very hard to undo. I think it's how best to understand how we got to where we were with the association agreement. Is there a point? I guess on the neutrality question, there could be, in fact, there's probably somewhere in between that could be achieved without much change to the status quo. There's a 2010 law that Yanukovych passed that made joining a military alliance illegal. It enforced a term that doesn't really have an English equivalent, that's sort of non-blockness, establishing Ukraine's non-blockness. I don't think that it's realistic to expect NATO heads of state to walk back a summit declaration, which they would have to do in this context, given what was said at Bucharest in 2008. But the current Ukrainian government has not undone that 2010 law, so there could be some in between that would satisfy to a certain extent all the parties. But there might not be, and it might not be worth going farther than maintenance of that current Ukrainian law.
Thanks. We'll take 3 questions, beginning with you, then Nigel, and then the gentleman sitting next to Nigel. Please.
Sure. Asia and Pacific. Yes. Samuel, I'm not too bright. I'm still confused about the snipers in mundane Kiev, earlier phase of February 21st. Who was behind it and why? I'm just interested. The next one is far more serious to my region. It seems that the West and Russia is going to have quite a tense relationship for some time now. What sort of knock-on effect will it have on exchanges between Moscow and Beijing? Thank you.
Nigel Inkster.
Nigel Inkster, Director of Transnational Threats, IISS. I'd like to switch to economics a bit and ask for your views on the economic prospects and long-term sustainability of the eastern Ukraine, which conventionally is presented as a kind of post-Soviet Rust Belt. Is it an economically viable entity, or does Russia face the prospect of long-term subvention of what de facto, if not de jure, becomes a kind of client state? And as a corollary to that, how important to Russia are the residual defense manufacturing capabilities in eastern Ukraine that were part of the Soviet-era supply chain?
Please.
Chris Bellamy, University of Greenwich. You mentioned the fact that people in the West accepted or hoped that the annexation of Ukraine, of Crimea, would be the end, and like the Crimea-only solution. Seems to me that the problem for this is the 1994 Budapest Accords, where Ukraine gave up the nuclear weapons that were on its soil in exchange for guarantees of its territorial integrity signed by the United States, Russia, Ukraine and Britain, later joined by France and China. Would you just like to say how big a deal you think those Budapest Accords are?
Shall I? I have no definitive information on the snipers. I've seen lots of different conflicting reports. I think there's an ongoing investigation, and be interested to see the results. Russia-China. Well, clearly, there are, with all doors, or many of them, closed in the West, Russia is not going to have a choice but to seek to engage more with China, and there's this amazing build-up to what is set to be this sort of, huge show that during Putin's visit to Beijing later this month. And just today, the Chinese Ministry of Defense announced that Russia and China will be holding joint naval exercises in the East China Sea. So I think there will be a lot of, on the economic side, there will be a lot of probably concrete things happening because Russia won't have a choice. And but on the strategic side, there probably will be more engagement. At the end of the day, though, I don't see the prospect of a Russia-China alliance as realistic.
Sorry, Victor. Will it that the Chinese will leverage in relation with Moscow? Because Moscow has big programs.
Absolutely. If Russia doesn't have any other options, then certainly. Economic sustainability. If you look above eastern and southern Ukraine, so it depends on which parts you're talking about, but at the end of the day, it's not, Ukraine is not sustainable without its east and south. It's 21.5 million people, and it is the economically dominant part of the country. Now, that having been said, like the rest of the Ukrainian economy, it is at best partially reformed. Interesting to see the Donbass miners coming out against Russia, generally speaking, but their rationale was quite interesting. That they said, look at the Russian mining industry, and what happened with the Russian mining industry is that it was subject to market forces, and a lot of the unprofitable enterprises had to close. So that's what they're trying to avoid, and I think a lot of the hard decisions that have been put off for 25 years on any number of aspects of economic development in the South and East are probably no longer possible to put off. All that having been said, sustainable as an entity in itself, it seems to me unlikely. At the end of the day, it has never operated that way, but many of the enterprises that employ the large quantities of people do depend on Russia as an export market, although many depend on Europe as an export market too. So it's a complicated situation. I think you're right to point to the military-industrial links. There were some in Crimea itself, enterprises, but there are many in the south and east, including in places like Zaporozhye, where the pro-Russian sentiment isn't quite as high. I mean, I believe it's there that Sich, which makes the engines for Russian helicopters, is based. So I think Putin has talked about this recently, in fact just yesterday I believe. It will take Russia a lot of money and some time to recreate those production capacities at home in the context of being deprived of a lot of the dual-use imports that it would probably need to do so. So it is going to be a tough slog if they're forced to do that. It doesn't strike me as a particularly viable option, though, for Ukraine or any government in Kiev to cut off that cooperation indefinitely because of the number of jobs that depend on it in that part of the country. And given the problems they have there already with their own legitimacy, I think that would be a step that they wouldn't want to take. Clearly, the Budapest Memorandum, the most egregious violation of the Budapest Memorandum, we should not be, whipping ourselves alone here, was by Russia, which was a signatory as well. And I think the sanctions for Crimea itself and the extent to which they were unprecedented, and it is important to note that these are not, people poo-poo them, but Gennady Timchenko's net worth is probably several times larger than the GDP of most other countries that have been sanctioned. This is not nothing, even that first round. But nonetheless, I think that explains why this has received such a strong response. Now, its implications for, it's important to note that these were security assurances and not guarantees. It's not a treaty obligation. But nonetheless, it does not help with the global nonproliferation regime. That having been said, if Ukraine did have its nuclear weapons that it was left with in 1991, in this context, they would have been completely useless. And it was unclear ever if they had the capacity to, the command and control, in any case, to use them. Because in the Soviet system, at least, it didn't reside in the field. And there were strategic weapons in the context of a battlefield situation. So I think it's important to keep that in mind as well. But certainly it doesn't help when we're trying to, in other contexts, issue security assurances to countries in the context of asking them to comply with non-proliferation commitments.
Thank you. 3 more questions. Gentleman right at the back on my right. Yes, please.
Tony Branson, former British ambassador from Moscow. First of all, thank you very much for the excellent presentation. Those of us who've been arguing rather lonely in this town over the last few weeks, need to talk to the Russians about this and do a deal. I find your intellectual support very encouraging, although I find it slightly depressing that you think that the moment for deal have gone past. I'd be interested in your comments on 2 aspects of this. First of all, in certain places around town, quite extensively, this whole thing has been turned into a narrative of Russian revanchism. Going in, taking Crimea, moving into eastern Ukraine, what comes next, Moldova, Estonia, what have you. And I'd be interested in your comments on that. And secondly, on the assumption that, looking at the assumptions that Western governments seem to be making, which is that somehow we can bully the Russians out of where they are in Ukraine by economic sanctions and other sanctions, I'd be interested in your comments on that as well. To what extent the instruments that we have at our disposal are actually able to turn Russia around.
Thank you. And you here on the second row.
Yeah, that makes sense. You spoke briefly about the East-West divide in Ukraine. You've spoken about how a few of the reforms are likely to adversely impact people more in the East and the South. I was wondering if you had any suggestions for the Ukrainian government, either the current one or the one that's going to come in, on how they can actually start to build bridges between the 2 sides and actually address that divide. Because it seems to me, because the longer the crisis goes on, the more likely that divide is going to crystallise into some sort of permanent identity divide, so to speak. And the more it's crystallised, the easier it is, obviously, for Russia to destabilise internally without having to leave.
Thank you. Nick Redmond.
Thanks, Nick Redmond, IISS. Thank you. The idea of following up to Brent's question about where the deal is to be done, and if we look at the Russian wish list, perhaps we can reach some sort of compromise on NATO, Russian language, guaranteed minority language around Ukraine, yeah, probably too. Obviously, the big debate right now is decentralization as against federalization. But if we put those aside, if we can get over that, I'm not sure we can, but if we can get over that, do you also feel that actually Russian and Western positions may be incompatible on the question of what is the acceptable mode for EU-Ukraine relations once this crisis blows over? I mean, NATO is for sure, but is the DCFTA also a red line for Russia?
Thank you.
Okay. Who's next? Should we be worried about Estonia, etc.? Thank you for the question, Mr. Brenton. It's my view that if you look at the what motivated Russia in this context, it's very hard, if not impossible, to replicate those circumstances in other parts of Europe, particularly NATO Europe. In fact, one of the reasons I think the Russian leadership resisted Ukrainian NATO membership is because they understand the difference between NATO and non-NATO Europe. I did mention a contingency that I thought might pose a problem for Moldova in the context of Transnistria, but that's really a Ukraine-specific contingency. It has nothing to do with designs on territory. Now, all that having been said, and sort of agreeing with the premise of your question that the talk is a bit inflated, it is a little bit, we are in a different situation where about the lengths Russia is prepared to go to to pursue its interests, and that is a change. And it's understandable, and having just been in Latvia, that countries such as Latvia and Estonia are worried. And therefore, I think the reassurance part of the response on behalf of the U.S. is good. Regardless of whether you think there's an immediate threat tomorrow, the deterrence impact of those kinds of reassurance missions, I think, is important. Should we be completely militarizing all of our Eastern and Central European allies, been having, installing the 101st Airborne Division in Tallinn permanently? I mean, probably that would be not a good thing to do in this context, but nonetheless, reassurance certainly does make a lot of sense to me. But no, I don't see an immediate threat to, especially NATO Europe, resulting from this crisis that, in terms of territorial encroachment. The assumption that Russia can be bullied into a different position through economic sanctions. It's my understanding that that is not the logic governing the sanctions. That I don't think the decision makers are quite that naive. At least that's my hope, or my impression so far. I think part of it has to do with the sanctions being more of a norm reinforcing gesture, so to speak, that, if a norm that is important is violated, there will be costs attached to that action, but without a sense that it will undo necessarily what Russia has done. And it might have played into the calculus regarding the need for a land invasion in the East and South, given that so much explicit signaling was made about sectoral sanctions being linked to that kind of a move. But I don't think that the sanctions are based on that assumption. Overall, though, what the alternative to coercing Russia into a change in its position is negotiating a change in its position. And I've had people in the U.S. government argue to me, well, that we tried that already and it didn't work. And maybe that's true, but at the same time, the alternative, I don't know that there is one at this point, to perhaps trying again. Unless we are prepared to do things that so far we haven't been prepared to do. Decentralization versus federalization. Frankly, I think that this is first of all, federalization long before this crisis was some sort of four-letter word in Kiev and among the Ukrainian elite, in part because, of course, whoever is in power has very little incentive to share it. And, Party of Regions has had this kind of thing in its platform until, of course, it actually was in power and then didn't do anything about implementing it. And that, in part stems from the fact that 80% of fiscal flows go through Kiev under the current system, which presumably would have to change if there was to be genuine decentralization. I don't think the term, or what you call it, is particularly important. If federalization is a bad word, fine. I mean, I like the term oblradizatsiya, which is from the regional parliamentization. I guess is the best translation, in the sense of empowering the currently elected regional parliaments to have executive authority over as opposed to the appointed governors that do exist. The question really here, in terms of what's acceptable and what isn't, is how far and how fast the Ukrainian authorities are willing to go on this score. And it was part of their platform, certainly part of the Maidan program before even they took office, compared to how much they have prioritized legitimizing themselves via the new presidential elections. Although I did want to get back to that. Suggestions for reform to address the regional divide in light before May or after May. A point to be made about the May elections is that they need not change the composition of the government under the current constitution. Under the constitution, as it has been reverted to following February 21st, the government answers to the parliament. So the government could be reshuffled tomorrow. And the government also doesn't have to change at all following a new presidential election. There seems to be an assumption that it might or that it may, although I've heard different things from, there was a Ukrainian deputy foreign minister who suggested that wouldn't be the case in Washington last week. In my view, the thing to do is change the composition of the government now. No one is stopping them from bringing in people at the center from the south and east, except for political realities, of course, in Kiev, which is not insignificant, but nonetheless. EU-Ukraine relations. I think this is a good question in the sense that it hasn't been at the fore on the Russian wish list. But I don't see why the Russian position would have changed since November, when it was clear that they were willing to go to pretty significant lengths to prevent the DCFTA from being signed. And it is the EU's intention to proceed with that signing in June. So I think we've got another potential friction point there. Perhaps they will have changed their position by that point, but I don't see any evidence to suggest that that would be the case.
Okay, we've got time for one more rapid fire round. Lady in the front here, been very patient.
Eva Lehmann, Finnish Broadcasting and Finnish Social Democratic Press. What conclusions would you think that a country like Finland should make out of these changes and changes in Russian foreign policy? We do belong to EU, but we do not belong to NATO. Would it have been reasonable to belong to NATO originally? Now I know it's not possible, but...
Okay, and you, sir? Yep.
The situation on the ground, how likely is it, do you think, the election will actually be held? And if the association agreement and the whole Eastern Partnership was a mistake, what should the EU have been doing the last few years?
You, sir?
From the Polish news agency. Just could you briefly comment on the oligarchs? Where do they stand and what's the balance sheet from their perspective? We know that one of them has been arrested in Vienna and jailed. The other one is running for the presidency. But what do the others think? Would they, for instance, sell their assets to the Russians, perhaps?
One more final taker. Lady at the back, right at the back, yes, by the fireplace.
Mary Dashevsky. I'd like to ask a bit more about the Geneva Agreement that fell so spectacularly apart. Because when I heard both Kerry and Lavrov talking immediately afterwards, it seemed to me that the American side had actually given a lot of ground and had moved quite far in the direction of what the Russians were asking for. But that the potential stumbling block was the occupations of the buildings and who was in charge. And the fact that Kiev treated what was happening in Kiev differently from the way that the West was demanding the immediate evacuation of the occupied buildings in the East, that was the stumbling block. And that is why it eventually fell apart. I mean, what is your view of why it fell apart?
Okay, thank you. Sam.
Conclusions for Finland. Finland has a very robust defense posture and a total defense concept that and a defense spending levels that would be the objective, or should be the objective, of many NATO member states. Frankly, I think Finland is in a way a model of one aspect of behavior that we haven't seen as much from European allies in recent years, that is spending on their own defense priorities. So if we could have more NATO allies like Finland in that respect, I think we'd be better off. How likely is the election to be held? Well, barring a radical change on the ground in the southeast, if the election is held, I'm not sure the extent to which it will be seen as legitimate. So I think, I don't know at this point. I think it's hard to tell. Hard to say, maybe 50-50. I don't think that an association agreement per se is a mistake, by no means. I think that, the EU has a lot of interest in Ukraine, and that the EU should be pursuing engagement with Ukraine, no question. The mistake is the form in which it took, which was very much not adapted to the circumstances in which the EU was operating. The assumption essentially was that you could sort of do use the sort of 20,000 pages the key communicator to sort of beat the Ukrainians into behaving differently, I guess. And I think that the question I would have had if, in fact, the EU's planned signing ceremony on November 19th or whenever it was had gone ahead is that was it actually going to be implemented under the Yanukovych government? I think taking account of Ukraine being different from previous aspirants and adjusting policies to based on the circumstances seems reasonable to me and not beyond the EU's bureaucratic capacity to address. Oligarchs, where do they stand? Well, some have had their fate changed by FBI warrants, as you mentioned. Others are doing just fine. As you mentioned, one is running for president. Actually, a couple are running for president. The front runner is an oligarch. I think their fates are varied, and they are certainly all positioning themselves. But generally speaking, the difference between, and this is an interesting phenomenon regarding the oligarchs from the south and east, is that they have, and in fact Putin has talked about this a lot, their views about foreign policy and foreign economic policy, and particularly EU integration, are not the same as the masses in the south and east. And they tend to be much more pro-EU at the end of the day than the average voter in Donetsk and Lugansk, for example. And I think that difference is coming out now on the ground, and I think it's reflected in Putin's sort of refusal to take these, consistent dismissal of the likes of Sergei Taruta and Kolomoisky in their roles as governors. So it's a bit of a mystery to me about the Geneva Agreement and what was expected after its signing. Let's recall that the photos that turned out to be a hoax were handed out by the State Department on the plane back from Geneva. So I don't know that the idea that they were dealing with a partner acting in good faith was that they could even maintain that premise for from the ride from the hotel to the plane. Now, that having been said, it is true that, but it's not just Kiev that treated those buildings in Kiev differently. U.S. officials have said the same, that they've been given permits, and therefore it's a different story. A bigger question for me is the extent to which Russia could, even if it wanted to, control events on the ground in southern and eastern Ukraine. If you talk to some of the people who've been out there with the OSCE, there is a genuine degree to which, even if there has been a degree of incitement or active encouragement of some of the separatists, or perhaps some leadership of them, there are forces beyond Putin's control at play in the south and east, and that could take things in a very different direction. Now, it is true that Russia has not come out and called for these buildings to be deoccupied, and that has been the consistent, point that officials from John Kerry on down have made since the Geneva Agreement. But whether if it had done so, that it would have been effective is an open question. So I don't know, and I think that it seems unlikely to me that Putin can pick up the phone and tomorrow all these buildings will be back to their legal owners. Maybe that's true, but it just seems unlikely at this point.
Sam, thank you very much indeed for a presentation that I think highlighted very effectively the different levels at which this policy conundrum operates, and at the ISS we're certainly keen to keep the spotlight focused on this question, including in the shape of devoting a lot of attention to it at the Global Strategic Review, which is the ISS members conference that will take place in Oslo this year from the 19th to the 21st of September, where we'll have sessions inter alia addressing the shape of the international system after, or still in fact during the Ukraine crisis, the shape of domestic political and economic developments in Ukraine, Russian military modernization, and then perhaps a more broader reflection on the question of the purpose and the limits of Western strategic capacity to deal with challenges of this magnitude. So I hope that you all visit the ISS website and get your registrations in for that as soon as possible. But in the meantime, please join me in thanking Sam for a first-rate presentation. Thank you.